My name is Paul Henderson. I'm 34 years old now, and the moment I discovered that the people who are supposed to love you most can become strangers in an instant. This is about watching $30,000, a lifetime of savings scraped together from midnight nursing shifts and skipped meals, disappear into the hands of people who never intended to say thank you. This is about standing at a crossroads where doing nothing would have been easier, where staying silent would have kept the peace, but where speaking up meant losing everything I thought I knew about family. And this is about a decision I made that day, a decision that would lead me to a courtroom, that would sever ties I thought were unbreakable, and that would ultimately teach me the most important lesson of my life. Because here's what nobody tells you when you're young and still believe in fairy tale endings. Sometimes the people who gave you life aren't the ones who teach you how to live it. Sometimes the person who sacrifices everything receives nothing in return. And sometimes, just sometimes, standing up for what's right means standing completely alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I'm here, why my grandmother is fighting back tears while my parents walk away without looking back, why I'm about to make a choice that will change the trajectory of my entire existence, you need to know how we got here. You need to know about the phone calls that started 3 months ago, sugary sweet, and suddenly frequent after years of silence. You need to know about the promises made over Sunday dinners, the excitement that built in my grandmother's eyes when she thought her children finally wanted her around. You need to know about the bank transfer, the one that emptied her account, the one my parents said was for all of us, for a once-in-a-lifetime family trip to Europe. And you need to know about this moment right now, this exact second when my father looks at my grandmother and says the words that will echo in my mind for the rest of my life. Mom, there's been a problem with the booking system. Your ticket, it wasn't confirmed. You should just go home. We'll take you somewhere local next time. I see her face crumble. I see the realization dawn that there never was a ticket. I see 30 years of sacrifice, of unconditional love, of waiting by the phone for calls that rarely came, all of it reflected in her eyes as understanding replaces hope. And I see my parents, my Aunt Paula, my Uncle Leon, my cousins, all of them turning toward the boarding gate with their European city sticker-covered luggage, funded entirely by the woman they're leaving behind. That's when I know. That's when everything I believed about family, about loyalty, about who deserves your protection, crystallizes into absolute clarity. That's when I make my choice. I'm not getting on that plane. I'm not leaving her here. And I'm damn sure not letting them get away with this. What happens next, the investigation I launch, the evidence I gather, the courtroom confrontation, the devastating truth that emerges, it will cost me the family I grew up with. But it will also lead me to understand what family really means. So let me take you back to where this really begins. Not here at the airport, but to a small town called Millbrook, Tennessee, to a childhood split between two worlds, and to the woman who showed me that love isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everyone else walks away. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city that hums with ambition and never quite sleeps. My father, Richard Henderson, worked as a structural engineer, always bent over blueprints, always calculating stress points and load capacities, always too busy to notice that his own family structure was cracking under the weight of neglect. My mother, Dana, was a certified public accountant, a woman who could track every penny in a corporate ledger but somehow couldn't account for the emotional bankruptcy growing in our home. We weren't poor, not by any measure. We lived in a decent neighborhood, had 2 cars in the driveway, took modest vacations to beach towns where my parents worked on their laptops while I built sandcastles alone. But our house was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Dinner conversations, when they happened, consisted of my parents asking about my grades, my test scores, my class ranking, as if I were a quarterly report they needed to review before moving on to more pressing matters. "How did you do on your chemistry exam, Paul?" my father would ask, not looking up from his phone. 87%, I'd answer. "That's a B+, Richard," my mother would interject, her tone sharp with disappointment. "Paul needs to be more consistent if he wants to get into a good college." And that would be it. The extent of our family bonding. No one asked if I had friends, if I was happy, if I needed anything beyond the material provisions they dutifully supplied. I learned early that my value in that house was measured in achievements, not in the fullness of who I was as a person. But every summer, something magical happened. Every June, as soon as school let out, I was sent to Millbrook, Tennessee, to stay with my grandmother, Dorothy Henderson. And those weren't just visits. They were oxygen after months of holding my breath. They were proof that love existed somewhere in the world, even if it wasn't in the house I called home for the other 9 months of the year. Millbrook was everything Charlotte wasn't. It was a town where people still sat on their porches in the evening, where the general store owner knew everyone's name, where the sound of cicadas filled the summer air like a symphony written specifically for those who needed reminding that life could be simple and beautiful. My grandmother's house sat on the edge of town, a small wooden structure painted pale yellow with white trim, surrounded by flower beds that she tended with the same care she once gave to her patients during her 40 years as a nurse. The front porch had a swing that creaked with each movement, a sound I came to associate with safety. The backyard had a vegetable garden where tomatoes grew fat and red, where green beans climbed their stakes like they were racing toward the sun, and where sunflowers stood tall like sentries guarding this small piece of paradise. Every time I arrived, the same ritual played out. I'd climb out of the car, usually driven by whichever parent had drawn the short straw for the 3-hour drive, and before my feet fully touched the gravel driveway, my grandmother would burst through the screen door, arms already open wide. "Paul, oh, my sweet boy, let me look at you." She'd grab my face in both hands, studying me like I was a masterpiece she got to admire only once a year. "You've grown at least 2 inches. They feeding you properly up there in Charlotte." By the time I was 14, I stood taller than her, but she never stopped pulling me into hugs that somehow made me feel both protected and valued in ways I never felt at home. She smelled like lavender soap and fresh bread, like antiseptic and earth, a combination that shouldn't have worked but somehow perfectly captured who she was, a healer who found peace in growing things. My grandmother, Dorothy Henderson, wasn't just kind, she was formidable. She'd raised 2 children as a single mother after her husband walked out when my father was 8 and Aunt Paula was 6. She'd worked double shifts at Millbrook General Hospital, sometimes going 36 hours without real sleep, coming home just long enough to make sure her kids had breakfast before heading back out. She'd put my father through engineering school and my aunt through business college, working extra holiday shifts to cover tuition, sacrificing every personal dream she might have had so they could build better lives. And what did she get in return? My father moved to Charlotte the day after graduation and called maybe once a month, duty calls that lasted exactly long enough to confirm she was still alive before he had to get back to work. Aunt Paula married a real estate developer named Marcus Winters and moved to Roswell, Georgia, to a neighborhood with gates and guards, where the houses looked like small museums and the lawns were maintained by crews who showed up before dawn. She called even less frequently, usually only on major holidays, conversations that felt more like boxes being checked than genuine connection. But my grandmother never complained, never asked them for money, even though I knew from overhearing hushed conversations that her pension barely covered her expenses, never demanded their time or attention, even though I could see the way her face lit up when the phone actually rang. She just kept living her quiet life in Millbrook, tending her garden, volunteering at the hospital where she'd once worked, and waiting for the people she'd sacrificed everything for to remember she existed. The walls of her house told the story of that waiting. Framed photographs lined the hallway, chronicled the lives of children and grandchildren who rarely visited. My father's engineering degree prominently displayed. Aunt Paula's wedding photo, in which Grandma stood slightly off to the side, as if even then she knew her place in her daughter's new life would be marginal. Pictures of me at various ages, school photos I didn't even know she had, evidence that she tracked my life even from a distance. She dusted those frames religiously, treating them like sacred objects. But I noticed, even as a child, that when she looked at them, her expression held more sadness than joy, like she was mourning something that was still technically alive. Those summers in Millbrook became my anchor. While my parents focused on their careers and my achievements, my grandmother focused on me, the actual human being, not the report card or the trophy or the college application in progress. We'd spend mornings in the garden, her teaching me the difference between weeds and wildflowers, showing me how to coax tomatoes into abundance, explaining that growing things required patience and attention, lessons I understood applied to more than just plants. We'd spend afternoons on the porch, her telling stories about her nursing career, About the time she talked a suicidal teenager off a ledge by simply sitting with him for 4 hours until he felt less alone. About the elderly patient who had no family and how my grandmother visited her every single day for 2 years until she passed, just so she wouldn't die surrounded by strangers. People need to know they matter, Paul. She told me one afternoon when I was 15, both of us shelling peas into a metal bowl. That's the real medicine, not the pills or the procedures. Just showing up and proving they're worth showing up for. I watched her gnarled fingers work, efficient despite the arthritis I knew caused her pain, and I thought about how nobody showed up for her. How my father and Aunt Paula had taken what they needed and moved on. How she gave and gave and gave. And the people who should have been giving back had somehow convinced themselves that the occasional phone call was sufficient gratitude for a lifetime of sacrifice. Grandma, I asked, teenage boldness making me brave. Doesn't it make you sad that Dad and Aunt Paula don't visit more? She paused, her hands stilling over the bowl. For a moment, I thought she might deflect, make excuses, protect them the way she always did. But then she looked at me with those clear gray eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen before, a flash of deep, abiding hurt that she usually kept carefully hidden. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly. It makes me sadder than you can possibly know. But I learned a long time ago that you can't make people love you the way you love them. You can only control how you love, not how you're loved in return. I chose to love them completely, without conditions. What they choose is up to them. But that's not fair. I protested, anger rising on her behalf. You gave them everything. Fair doesn't enter into it when it comes to your children, she said, returning to the peas. You love them because they're yours, not because they've earned it or because they'll pay you back. That's what real love is, Paul. It's not a transaction. I didn't fully understand then. I was too young, too idealistic, too convinced that love should be reciprocal, that people who receive devotion should return it in equal measure. But I filed her words away, not knowing that years later, they would become the framework through which I'd have to make the hardest decision of my life. As I grew older, the contrast between my two worlds became starker. In Charlotte, I was a commodity, valued for what I could achieve. In Millbrook, I was a person, valued for simply existing. In Charlotte, conversations centered on productivity, efficiency, measurable outcomes. In Millbrook, conversations meandered through memories, feelings, observations about the way light hit the sunflowers in late afternoon, things that mattered precisely because they served no practical purpose. I started to understand that my grandmother's house wasn't just a place I visited. It was an education in what it meant to be human, to prioritize connection over achievement, presence over productivity. She taught me to bake bread, explaining that the kneading was meditative, that the waiting for dough to rise was practice and patience, that the sharing of something made with your own hands was an act of love. She taught me to really see people, to notice when the mailman seemed sad, when the grocery store clerk needed someone to ask how she was really doing, when the elderly neighbor might appreciate help carrying groceries up his steps. Most people walk through life looking but not seeing, Paul. She told me during one of our evening porch sessions, fireflies beginning their nightly dance across her yard. They're so focused on where they're going that they miss who's right in front of them, who needs them right now. Don't be one of those people. The destination doesn't matter half as much as who you become along the way. I was 17 the last summer I spent in Millbrook before everything changed, on the cusp of senior year, already fielding questions about college applications and future plans. My parents had decided I should pursue engineering like my father, a practical career with clear financial rewards. But sitting on that porch with my grandmother, watching the sun set behind the hills, I admitted something I'd barely acknowledged to myself. I think I want to be a doctor, I said quietly, half expecting her to laugh or tell me I was being impractical. Instead, her face broke into the widest smile I'd ever seen. Like me, she said, not a question but a recognition. Not exactly like you, I clarified. You were a nurse. I want to be a physician. Same heart, different letters after your name, she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. You want to help people. You want to show up for them when they're at their most vulnerable. That's the calling, Paul. That's what matters. Mom and Dad won't like it, I admitted. Medical school is longer, more expensive. They'll say engineering is more practical. Your parents measure everything in dollars and timelines, she said, her tone gentle but honest in a way she rarely was about her own children. But you can't measure what matters in spreadsheets. You have a healer's heart, sweetheart. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore it. That conversation became my North Star. When I returned to Charlotte and announced my intention to pursue pre-med, my parents reacted exactly as predicted. My father called it impractical, pointed out the years of training, the debt, the delayed earning potential. My mother worried about the instability, the demanding hours, the toll it would take on my future family life. But I held firm, carrying my grandmother's words like armor. Over the next year, as I navigated applications and entrance exams, my grandmother and I talked on the phone every Sunday evening. She'd ask about my studies, but more importantly, she'd ask about me, how I was feeling, what I was discovering about myself, whether I was taking time to notice the world around me or getting lost in the pressure. Those conversations were lifelines, reminders that someone, somewhere, cared about more than my grade point average. Then, in the spring of my senior year, everything shifted. It started with a phone call that came not on Sunday evening, but on a Wednesday afternoon. My father, his voice unusually warm, almost jovial, told me about a family trip being planned, a grand tour of Europe, Paris, Rome, London, the kind of trip we'd never taken as a family before. "We're thinking late June," he said, excitement bleeding through the phone. "After graduation. The whole family, including your grandmother." My heart leaped. The whole family, including my grandmother, meant she wouldn't be left behind, wouldn't spend another summer waiting for visitors who never came, wouldn't have to look at those photo frames and wonder why the people in them couldn't spare more than a phone call. "That sounds amazing, Dad," I said, genuinely enthusiastic for the first time in recent memory about something involving my parents. "Grandma's going to love it." Actually, my mother cut in. She'd been listening on the other line. "We were hoping you could help convince her. It's an expensive trip, and we thought if everyone contributed, it would be more meaningful. You know, a real family investment." Something about her tone made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. Grandma had savings from her nursing career, money she'd carefully set aside. If she wanted to contribute to a family trip, especially one where she'd finally get to spend real time with her children and grandchildren, that seemed reasonable. "I can talk to her," I offered, "but I think she'll be excited just to be included." Over the next few weeks, I watched my parents transform into people I barely recognized. My father started calling his mother weekly, conversations where his voice took on a sweetness I'd never heard before. "How are you doing, Mom? Eating well? I was just thinking about you." My mother sent cards and small gifts, a scarf, a book, tokens that seemed thoughtful but felt somehow calculated. Aunt Paula suddenly became attentive too, calling Grandma, visiting Millbrook for the first time in 3 years, bringing her husband Marcus and my cousins, Jennifer and Dylan, who I barely knew despite being related to them. When my father announced we were all driving to Millbrook for a Sunday dinner to discuss the trip, I should have known something was wrong. Our family didn't do spontaneous gatherings. We barely did planned gatherings. But I was 18 and naive, still operating under the assumption that blood ties meant something, that parents wouldn't exploit their own mother, that the sudden attention was genuine rather than strategic. That Sunday in Millbrook, I watched a performance that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so disgusting. We descended on my grandmother's small house like a swarm, filling her living room with bodies and noise she wasn't accustomed to. Aunt Paula complimented the house she'd previously called quaint in a tone that meant cramped and outdated. Marcus, who'd never shown any interest in my grandmother, asked about her garden like he actually cared. Jennifer and Dylan, both teenagers glued to their phones, at least made eye contact when she spoke to them. My father orchestrated the conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra, steering everything toward the Europe trip with practiced ease. He painted it in golden terms: the Eiffel Tower at sunset, gondolas in Venice, the Roman Colosseum, all of us together, making memories that would last a lifetime. "Mom," he said, his hand on my grandmother's shoulder, "this is your chance to see the world. You worked your whole life, sacrificed so much for Paula and me. This is our way of saying thank you, of finally showing you how much you mean to us." I watched my grandmother's face, saw hope bloom there like those sunflowers in her garden, reaching toward light after a long darkness. She wanted to believe them. God, she wanted so badly to believe that her children finally saw her, finally valued her, finally wanted her present in their lives. I don't know, she said hesitantly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. I'm 72. My health isn't what it used to be. A trip that long, all that travel, I'm not sure I can manage it. We'll be right there with you, Mom. Aunt Paula jumped in, her voice dripping with concern that would have been touching if it had been real. We'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about a thing. This is about family, about all of us being together. My grandmother looked at me then, her eyes searching mine for guidance. Paul, do you think I should go? And here's where I failed her, where my naivety became complicity, where I became part of the trap even though I didn't know I was setting it. Grandma, I said, taking her hand, believing every word I was saying. I think it would be amazing. We'll see everything together. I'll help you with whatever you need. Please come. Her resistance crumbled. If I wanted her there, if her grandson who actually spent time with her thought it was a good idea, then maybe it was. Maybe this really was her children finally making amends, finally recognizing what she deserved. All right, she said softly, offering a small smile. If you all really want me there, I'll go. The room erupted in cheers and hugs that felt theatrical even to my untrained eye. But I was caught up in it too, genuinely happy that my grandmother would get this experience, that our fragmented family might actually come together for once. It wasn't until later, after we'd eaten the dinner my grandmother prepared despite being the guest of honor, after my parents and Aunt Paula had stepped outside for what they called a quick discussion, that I overheard the truth. I'd gone to my truck to grab my jacket and found myself near the open window of my grandmother's kitchen, where my parents and Aunt Paula stood talking in voices they thought were private. She transferred it all, my mother said, her tone flat and businesslike. Every penny. $30,000, exactly what we calculated she had. My blood turned to ice. Perfect, Aunt Paula replied. That'll cover most of the hotels and at least half the airfare. Marcus and I can actually upgrade our tickets now. Are we sure about this? My father asked, and for half a second I thought he might have a conscience. Not telling her about the ticket situation until the airport? Richard, we've been over this, my mother said impatiently. If we tell her before, she'll demand the money back. This way, it's already spent, already non-refundable. What's she going to do? Sue her own children? They laughed. All three of them laughed like they'd just told a funny joke instead of plotting to defraud an elderly woman who happened to be their mother. I stood there in the darkness, my hand frozen on the truck door, trying to process what I'd just heard. They never intended to take her. They'd manufactured this entire scenario, the sudden attention, the family dinner, the emotional manipulation, all of it designed to get her to voluntarily hand over her life savings. And then they were planning to abandon her at the airport, to leave her standing there with her suitcase and her broken heart while they boarded a plane funded entirely by her money. I wanted to burst through that door, to confront them, to demand they return every cent and beg her forgiveness. But I was 18, legally an adult, but emotionally still a kid who couldn't quite believe his parents capable of something so cruel. So I did nothing. I got in my truck and drove back to Charlotte, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, telling myself I'd misunderstood, that there had to be another explanation, that my parents couldn't possibly be the monsters that conversation suggested. Over the next 3 weeks, as the trip approached, I watched my parents prepare with growing dread. They bought new luggage, researched restaurants, planned excursions, all funded by money that wasn't theirs, that had been extracted through lies and manipulation. My grandmother called me twice, nervous about the trip, worried she'd slow everyone down, asking if I was sure she should go. Both times I reassured her, my voice hollow, because what else could I do? Tell her the truth and break her heart early? Stay silent and let them break it at the airport? I was paralyzed, caught between loyalty to family and recognition of wrong. Too inexperienced to understand that sometimes loyalty to the people who gave you life means standing against them when they're causing harm. The night before our departure, my grandmother arrived at our Charlotte house, taking a Greyhound bus because my parents, suddenly too busy with last-minute preparations to make the drive to Millbrook. She showed up with that same old suitcase, dark green and battered, probably the same one she'd used when traveling for nursing conferences decades ago. I met her at the door and wrapped her in a hug that lasted longer than normal, because part of me already knew I was about to watch something terrible unfold. Paul, sweetheart, you're squeezing me like you're going to Europe without me, she joked, but her eyes were uncertain. searching my face for reassurance I couldn't quite give. She stayed in our guest room that night, and I stayed up with her, sitting on the edge of the bed while she showed me the small amount of clothes she'd packed. Practical things, comfortable shoes, a cardigan, a single dress she said was for nice dinners. I don't need much, she said, folding and refolding the same shirt. Just to be with my family. That's all I really want. I had to leave the room because I couldn't let her see me cry. The next morning arrived too quickly, all of us piling into my father's SUV for the drive to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. My grandmother sat in the back seat next to me, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally reaching over to pat my knee like she was the one who needed to comfort me instead of the other way around. The airport was chaos, travelers everywhere, the constant drone of announcements, the smell of overpriced coffee, and anxiety. We met Aunt Paula's family at the main terminal. Marcus looking like he was already on vacation with his designer sunglasses and expensive carry-on. Jennifer and Dylan barely glancing up from their phones to acknowledge any of us. Aunt Paula gave my grandmother a quick hug, the kind you give to acquaintances, not to the woman who raised you. "Ready for your big adventure, Mom?" she asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. We moved toward the check-in counters as a group, wheeling suitcases, juggling carry-ons, my grandmother keeping pace despite the arthritis I knew made walking difficult for her. She clutched her old purse, the same one she'd carried for as long as I could remember, and her suitcase handle, her knuckles white with either excitement or anxiety. I couldn't tell which. That's when I noticed my father having an intense conversation with someone at the airline desk, his face reddening, my mother beside him with her arms crossed in that defensive posture she adopted when things weren't going her way. My grandmother noticed too. "Paul, what's happening? Is something wrong with the flight?" she asked, her voice small and worried. I didn't know what to say because I did know, had known since that night outside her kitchen window, but had convinced myself that surely they wouldn't actually go through with it. Surely at the last minute, conscience would prevail, human decency would win. They'd reveal this had all been some terrible test of character that I'd somehow misunderstood. But I was wrong. My father turned from the desk, his expression a calculated mix of concern and regret that would have been convincing if I hadn't known better. He walked over to where my grandmother stood, and I saw her straighten up, preparing herself for whatever news was coming. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle in a way that made my skin crawl. "There's been a problem with the booking system. Your ticket, it seems it wasn't confirmed properly." The words hit her like physical blows. I watched her face, saw confusion give way to understanding, saw the exact moment when she realized this wasn't a technical error, but a deliberate exclusion. "What do you mean it wasn't confirmed?" she asked, her voice steady but her hands starting to shake. "The ticket I paid for, that I transferred money for, somehow didn't get confirmed." My father had the audacity to look embarrassed. "It's complicated, Mom. These online systems, sometimes they glitch. The important thing is, you should probably just head back home. We don't want you to be uncomfortable trying to sort this out here. Next time we'll plan something local, somewhere closer, somewhere more your speed." Somewhere more your speed. Like she was a child being told the roller coaster was too advanced for her, not a woman being robbed and abandoned by the children she'd sacrificed everything to raise. "Mom, Dad." I stepped forward, my voice louder than I intended, drawing stares from nearby travelers. "What are you talking about? Grandma paid for this trip. How can there not be a ticket?" My mother shot me a warning look. "Paul, this is an adult conversation. The booking situation is complicated, and we don't have time to explain it all right now. We have a flight to catch." "Then I'm not going either," I said, the words coming out before I'd fully thought them through, but feeling absolutely right the moment they left my mouth. "If Grandma's not going, I'm staying with her." My grandmother grabbed my arm. "Paul, no. You don't have to do that. This is probably just a mix-up. You should go, enjoy the trip. Don't miss out because of me." But I was looking at my parents, really seeing them maybe for the first time in my life. My father's jaw was clenched, irritation replacing the fake concern. My mother's eyes were cold, calculating, already moving past this moment to the vacation they'd funded with stolen money. Aunt Paula stood off to the side with Marcus, both of them deliberately not making eye contact, letting my parents handle the dirty work they were all complicit in. "No, Grandma," I said, turning to face her fully, taking both her hands in mine. "This isn't a mix-up. This was never a mix-up. They never booked you a ticket. They took your money and never planned on taking you at all. I said it loud enough that people around us stopped and stared, loud enough that my family couldn't pretend this was a private matter, loud enough that the truth hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. My father's face went from red to purple. You have no idea what you're talking about, Paul. You're embarrassing yourself and this family. I'm embarrassing the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You stole $30,000 from your own mother. You manipulated her, lied to her, made her think you actually wanted her around, and now you're abandoning her at an airport. And I'm the one embarrassing the family. Aunt Paula finally spoke up, her tone condescending. Paul, you're being dramatic. Mom gave us that money as a gift for the family. She knew the trip might be too much for her. This is all being blown out of proportion. Is that true, Grandma? I asked, looking down at her. Did you give them the money as a gift, knowing you weren't going? Her eyes were filling with tears, but her voice was clear. No, I gave them the money because they said it was for all of us. For our family trip. They said they wanted me there, that I deserved to see the world, that this was their way of thanking me. She looked at my father, at Aunt Paula, at the people who had come from her body, who she'd worked herself to exhaustion to provide for, and I saw something break in her expression. You never wanted me there, did you? You just wanted my money. The silence that followed was damning. No one denied it. No one rushed to reassure her. No one apologized. They just stood there, caught, exposed, and instead of showing remorse, they showed annoyance that their plan had been interrupted. This is ridiculous, Marcus finally said, checking his watch. We're going to miss our flight if we keep standing here arguing. Dorothy, I'm sorry you feel upset, but you're an adult. You made a choice to contribute financially. That's on you. He spoke to her like she was a business associate who'd made a bad investment, not his wife's elderly mother who'd just been conned out of her life savings. And that's when I felt it. The final thread connecting me to these people snapped completely. You're all disgusting, I said, my voice shaking not with fear, but with rage. Every single one of you. Grandma, we're leaving. We're going back to Millbrook, and I swear to you, I will make this right. My father stepped toward me, his finger pointing at my chest. If you walk away from this family right now, if you choose her over us, you'll regret it, Paul. You hear me? You walk away, and you're done. No more tuition support, no more car insurance, no more anything. You'll be completely on your own. I looked at him, this man who'd given me half my genetic material, but nothing else that mattered, and I felt nothing but pity. I've always been on my own, Dad. The only person who was never really there for me was Grandma. So yeah, I choose her. Every single time. I grabbed my grandmother's suitcase with one hand and took her arm with the other. She was crying now, silent tears rolling down her weathered cheeks, but she let me guide her away from the check-in desk, away from the people who should have protected her but chose to exploit her instead. Behind us, I heard my mother call out, her voice sharp with anger rather than concern. You're making a huge mistake, Paul. When you come crawling back, don't expect us to welcome you with open arms. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, my grandmother beside me, moving through the crowd of strangers who were kinder than my own family simply by virtue of not actively trying to hurt us. We made it outside to the taxi stand before my grandmother stopped, her hand gripping my arm. Paul, what are you doing? Your future, your college, everything you worked for. Grandma, I interrupted gently, bending down so we were eye level. You are my family. The only family that matters. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. But I will never, ever stand by and watch people hurt you. Not even if they're my parents. She pulled me into a hug then, right there on the sidewalk outside the airport, and we stood like that while travelers flowed around us, while planes took off overhead, carrying people toward vacations and reunions and futures. We stood there while somewhere inside that building, my parents and aunt and uncle and cousins boarded a flight funded by money that wasn't theirs, consciences apparently untroubled by the woman they'd left behind. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address in Millbrook. The drive took nearly 4 hours, my grandmother sitting quietly beside me, occasionally wiping tears, occasionally squeezing my hand. We didn't talk much because what was there to say? Everything we both believed about family had been revealed as a lie in the span of 20 minutes. When we finally pulled up to her small yellow house with the white trim and the flower beds, it was early evening. The sunflowers in her garden stood tall, indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded, concerned only with turning their faces toward the fading light. I helped my grandmother inside, carrying her suitcase to her bedroom. The trip it had been packed for now a bitter joke. She sank into her favorite armchair, the one by the window where she'd spent so many evenings waiting for phone calls that rarely came. And she just sat there, staring at nothing. I made her tea, brought her one of the quilts she kept folded on the couch, tried to think of something comforting to say, and came up empty. "I'm sorry, Grandma," I finally whispered, kneeling beside her chair. "I'm so sorry they did this to you." She looked at me with eyes that held more pain than any person should have to carry. "Paul, do you know what the worst part is? It's not even the money. It's that I really thought they wanted me. I really believed that after all these years of being pushed aside, of being forgotten except when it was convenient, that maybe they'd finally realized I mattered. I'm such a fool." "You're not a fool," I said fiercely. "You loved them without conditions, and they took advantage of that. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes them cruel." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "How do you recover from discovering that the people you sacrificed your entire life for see you as nothing more than a source of funding? How do you come back from that kind of betrayal?" I spent that night in my grandmother's guest room, the same room I'd slept in every summer of my childhood, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what happened next. My parents had made their choice clear. I was cut off, on my own, no financial support for college or anything else. I'd managed to save some money from summer jobs, but not nearly enough for tuition at the pre-med program I'd been accepted into. But none of that mattered as much as the question burning in my mind: how do I make this right? How do I get justice for a woman who would never seek it for herself? That's when I remembered something my grandmother had told me years ago, during one of our porch conversations when I was maybe 14 or 15. We'd been talking about a news story, some case of elder abuse that had shocked our small town. "The worst part about crimes against elderly people," she'd said, her voice thoughtful, "is that they often go unreported. Either the victims are too ashamed to admit what happened, or they're afraid of retaliation, or they just don't know there are systems in place to help them. But there are, Paul. There are agencies specifically designed to protect vulnerable adults, to investigate financial abuse, to hold people accountable even when those people are family members." At the time, I'd filed the information away as interesting but not personally relevant. Now, lying in that guest room, it blazed in my mind like a neon sign pointing toward exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I waited until my grandmother was still sleeping, exhausted from emotional devastation, and I started researching. Adult Protective Services in Tennessee, their jurisdiction, their process, what constituted financial abuse, what kind of evidence they needed. I read case studies, success stories, horror stories, legal precedents, everything I could find about elderly people who'd been exploited by family members and the systems designed to protect them. By noon, I had a plan. I made coffee, waited for my grandmother to wake up, and when she finally emerged from her bedroom, eyes still red and puffy, I sat her down at the kitchen table. "Grandma, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, choosing my words carefully. "What they did to you, taking your money under false pretenses, deliberately lying to you about the trip, that's not just morally wrong. It's legally wrong. It's financial elder abuse, and there are agencies that handle exactly these kinds of cases." She shook her head immediately. "Paul, no. I can't do that to my children. I can't drag them into court, make a big public mess of this. They're still my kids." "They stole from you, Grandma," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle but firm. "They manipulated you, lied to you, and then abandoned you. And if we don't do something, what's to stop them from doing it again? Or doing it to someone else? Someone who doesn't have anyone to stand up for them." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug, steam rising between us like the ghosts of all the years she'd made excuses for her children's neglect. "I don't want the money back," she finally said. "I just wanted them to love me." "I know," I whispered, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But Grandma, love isn't supposed to cost $30,000. And what they did, that wasn't love. That was exploitation. You deserve better. You deserve justice." She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the same strength that had carried her through 40 years of nursing shifts, through single parenthood, through decades of being undervalued and overlooked, rise to the surface. "If you think it's right," she said slowly, "if you really believe this is what we should do, then I'll trust you, Paul. Because you're the only person who's ever really stood up for me. That trust was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. I just turned 18, barely an adult myself, about to take on a legal battle against my own parents with no money, no resources, and no real understanding of how any of this worked. But I had something more important than resources. I had the absolute certainty that what they'd done was wrong, and that staying silent would make me complicit in that wrong. That afternoon, I called the Tennessee Department of Adult Protective Services. I was transferred 3 times before landing with a caseworker named Janet Kimmel, a woman whose voice over the phone conveyed both warmth and no-nonsense competence. "Tell me what happened," she said, and I did. I told her everything, from the initial phone calls to the family dinner in Millbrook to the scene at the airport. I told her about the $30,000 transfer, about my grandmother's savings being wiped out, about the deliberate deception and abandonment. Janet listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of acknowledgement, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Paul," she said finally, "what you're describing is textbook financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The premeditation, the false pretenses, the amount of money involved. This is serious. But I need you to understand that pursuing this will be hard on you and your grandmother. These cases can get ugly, especially when family is involved. Are you both prepared for that?" I looked across the kitchen at my grandmother, who was watching me with anxious eyes, trusting me to navigate this situation she never should have been put in. "Yes," I said. "We're prepared." "All right then," Janet replied, her tone shifting to business mode. "Here's what happens next. I'll open an official investigation. I'll need to interview your grandmother, get her statement on record. I'll need bank records showing the transfer, any written communication about the trip, witness statements if possible. Can you help gather that information?" "Yes," I said again, my mind already cataloging what we'd need. The bank in Millbrook where my grandmother had her account, the emails my parents had sent about the trip, Holly the airport employee who'd witnessed the confrontation. I can get all of that. We scheduled an appointment for 2 days later at the APS office in Nashville, a drive from Millbrook, but manageable. When I hung up, I felt like I'd just crossed a bridge that was burning behind me. There was no going back now, no reconciliation with my parents possible after this. But that bridge had been rotten anyway, built on expectations that I perform and achieve rather than on genuine connection, and maybe it was better to let it burn than to keep trying to cross something fundamentally unsound. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. My grandmother and I drove to her bank, where the manager, a kind woman named Patricia who'd known my grandmother for 30 years, was horrified by what had happened. "Dorothy, why didn't you call me before making such a large transfer?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "I would have advised you to be more cautious, to at least structure it as a loan rather than an outright gift. I didn't think I needed to protect myself from my own children," my grandmother said quietly, and the shame in her voice broke my heart all over again. Patricia printed out the complete transaction history, highlighting the $30,000 transfer that had wiped out my grandmother's savings account. She also printed statements showing the years of careful deposits, the evidence of a life spent living frugally, saving diligently, working extra shifts, all of it gone in a single transaction based on lies. I contacted the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, explaining that I needed to reach an employee named Holly who'd worked the international terminal check-in desk on the day in question. After being transferred approximately 7 times, I finally got through to someone in human resources who could help. Holly remembered the incident without me even having to explain much. "Oh God, yes, I remember," she said when I described the scene. "That poor elderly woman, standing there with her suitcase while her family just left her. It was one of the cruelest things I've ever witnessed working here, and I've seen a lot. They told her to just go home, like she was an inconvenience they were discarding. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you witnessed?" I asked, holding my breath. "Absolutely," Holly said without hesitation. "What they did was wrong. If I can help make it right, I want to." I also went through my grandmother's email, finding the messages my father and Aunt Paula had sent about the trip. Reading them now, with full knowledge of their intentions, made me physically ill. My father's email subject line, "Family trip of a lifetime, everyone included," was particularly galling, as was Aunt Paula's message about finally showing Mom how much she means to us. Every word was manipulation, carefully crafted to extract money from a woman desperate to believe her children finally valued her. On the day of our appointment in Nashville, my grandmother dressed in her best outfit, a simple navy dress she usually reserved for church, and I wore the one suit I owned, purchased for college interviews I might not even be attending anymore, depending on how this all played out. The APS office was located in a nondescript government building, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting, but Janet Kimmel herself was anything but nondescript. She was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an immediate presence that communicated both compassion and absolute competence. She shook both our hands firmly, led us to a small conference room, and sat down with a legal pad and a recorder. "Mrs. Henderson," she began, her voice gentle, "I'm going to need you to tell me the whole story, in your own words. Take your time. This is being recorded for the official investigation, but you're not on trial here. You're the victim, and my job is to help you." My grandmother took a shaky breath and began to speak. I'd never heard her talk about it all in one continuous narrative before, and listening to her describe the years of being pushed aside, the sudden attention that felt too good to be true but that she wanted so badly to believe, the transfer of every penny she had, the moment at the airport when she realized it had all been a lie, it took everything in me not to break down. Janet took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Did they ever explicitly promise that you would be on the trip if you contributed financially?" "Yes," my grandmother said. "Multiple times. They said it was a family trip, that everyone would be together, that this was their way of thanking me for everything I'd done for them." "And at any point did they suggest the money was a gift rather than a contribution to a trip you'd be attending?" "Not until the airport," my grandmother replied. "That's when Paula said something about the money being for the family, but that was after they'd already taken it, after I realized there was no ticket for me." Janet nodded, writing furiously. "And Paul, you overheard them discussing this plan before the airport?" I recounted the conversation I'd heard outside my grandmother's kitchen window, the casual way they'd talked about taking her money and the non-refundable nature of their plans, the laughter. Janet's expression darkened. "Premeditation," she said, almost to herself. "That's going to be important." The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, my grandmother was exhausted, and I felt wrung out just from witnessing her have to relive the betrayal in such detail. But Janet seemed satisfied. "All right," she said, organizing her notes. "Based on what you've told me and the documentation Paul has provided, I'm moving forward with a full investigation into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I'll be contacting your son, your daughter, and your son-in-law to get their statements. They'll likely lawyer up immediately, but that's fine. We have solid evidence here, the bank records, the witness testimony, the emails, and most importantly, we have your account of what happened." "What happens next?" I asked. "I'll compile my investigation report and submit it to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for prosecution," Janet explained. "These cases can be handled civilly or criminally, depending on the severity. Given the amount of money involved and the clear premeditation, I'll be recommending criminal charges for financial exploitation, which is a felony in Tennessee. Simultaneously, you can file a civil suit to recover the money." My grandmother looked overwhelmed. "Criminal charges? Against my own children?" Janet's expression softened. "Mrs. Henderson, I know this is hard. Family cases always are. But what they did to you wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal. And part of my job is making sure that people who exploit the elderly face consequences, family or not. Otherwise, what's to stop them from doing this to someone else's grandmother?" Over the next 3 weeks, Janet worked quickly and efficiently. She contacted my parents and Aunt Paula, who, as predicted, immediately hired lawyers and refused to speak with APS without legal representation. She interviewed Holly by phone, getting her official statement. She worked with the bank to verify every detail of the financial transaction, and she compiled a report that, when she let me read it, laid out the case in damning detail. My parents' response came through their lawyer, a slick attorney from Charlotte who specialized in white-collar defense. Their position was that my grandmother had made a voluntary gift to help fund a family trip, that there had been a genuine technical issue with her ticket that was the airline's fault, not theirs, and that this was all a misunderstanding being blown out of proportion by a teenage grandson who didn't understand adult financial arrangements. It was gaslighting on a legal level, trying to reframe exploitation as generosity, abandonment as technical difficulties, and my intervention as youthful ignorance. But Janet wasn't buying it. Neither was the assistant district attorney she brought into the case, a sharp young prosecutor named Michael Torres who took one look at the evidence and said, "This is one of the clearest cases of elder financial abuse I've seen. Let's nail them." The decision was made to pursue both criminal and civil remedies. The criminal case would focus on holding my parents and Aunt Paula accountable through the justice system, potentially including fines and even jail time. The civil case would focus on recovering my grandmother's money and potentially additional damages for the emotional harm caused. I enrolled my grandmother in a victims assistance program through the DA's office, connecting her with a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. She was reluctant at first, insisting she didn't need therapy, but after a few sessions, I saw some of the weight start to lift from her shoulders. "It helps to talk to someone who understands that this wasn't my fault," she told me after her third session. "I kept thinking I should have known better, should have seen through them. But the therapist says that's exactly what abusers count on, that shame and self-blame that keeps victims silent." While all this was unfolding, I had to figure out my own future. My parents had made good on their threat to cut me off financially. I was on my own for college funding, which meant my acceptance to my first-choice pre-med program was no longer viable. The tuition was too high, and I had no cosigner for loans. But my grandmother, despite everything she'd been through, despite losing her savings, stepped in. "Paul, I have this house," she said one evening as we sat on her porch. "It's paid off, been paid off for 20 years. We can take out a home equity line of credit against it. That'll give you enough for community college, and then you can transfer to a 4-year school. You're not giving up your dreams because you stood up for me." "Grandma, no," I protested. "This house is all you have. I can't put it at risk." "This house is just wood and nails," she said firmly. "You are my family, my real family, the only person who chose me when it mattered. If I can't invest in your future, then what's the point of having anything at all?" So that's what we did. We took out a line of credit, enough to cover my tuition at the local community college where I could complete my prerequisites for medical school. I got a job at Millbrook General Hospital, the same place my grandmother had worked for 40 years, starting as an orderly working night shifts while taking classes during the day. It was exhausting, but every time I walked those hospital corridors, I thought about my grandmother doing the same thing while raising 2 kids alone, and I found the strength to keep going. The criminal case moved slowly, as legal proceedings always do. There were motions filed by my parents' lawyer, attempts to get the charges dismissed, arguments that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, procedural delays that seemed designed to wear us down. But Michael Torres was tenacious, filing responses to every motion, presenting the evidence clearly and compellingly, refusing to let my parents' expensive legal team intimidate him into backing down. 8 months after the airport incident, we finally got a trial date. The criminal trial would come first, the state of Tennessee versus Richard Henderson, Dana Henderson, and Paula Winters, charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a Class C felony carrying potential prison time and significant fines. The civil trial, where we'd seek to recover the money plus damages, would follow after the criminal verdict. The weeks leading up to the trial were tense. My grandmother barely slept, anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms, headaches, stomach problems, the stress of having to potentially testify against her own children taking a visible toll. I'd completed 1 year of community college by this point, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working 30 hours a week at the hospital, but my focus wavered as the trial approached. Janet prepared us extensively for what to expect. She explained that my parents' defense would likely try to paint my grandmother as willing participant in a family financial arrangement, that they'd try to make this seem like a misunderstanding or a disagreement about the terms of a gift rather than deliberate fraud. She warned us that they might attack my credibility, suggest I was manipulating my grandmother for my own gain, possibly even trying to secure an inheritance. "They're going to fight dirty," Janet said bluntly during one of our preparation sessions. "Family cases always do because people feel like they have nothing to lose. You need to be ready for that." The trial took place in a Davidson County courtroom, a wood-paneled room that somehow managed to feel both imposing and intimate. I sat next to my grandmother in the gallery, her hand gripping mine so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers as the jury was selected and opening arguments began. Michael Torres was brilliant in his opening statement, laying out the case with clear, compelling narrative force. He described a woman who had sacrificed everything for her children only to be manipulated and discarded when they decided her money was more valuable than her presence. He presented the evidence methodically, the timeline of contact increasing only when money was needed, the bank transfer that wiped out her savings, the witness testimony from the airport, the emails full of false promises. My parents' attorney, the expensive lawyer from Charlotte, took a different approach. He painted a picture of generous adult children trying to include their elderly mother in a family trip, of a woman who chose to contribute financially because she wanted to be part of something special, of a genuine technical issue with airline tickets that had been unfortunately mishandled. He suggested that the family drama was the result of miscommunication compounded by a grandson with an axe to grind against his parents. The prosecution called witnesses over the course of 3 days. Patricia from the bank testified about the unusual nature of the large withdrawal and my grandmother's financial prudence prior to the transfer. Holly from the airport testified about what she'd witnessed, describing in clear detail how my parents and Aunt Paula had dismissed my grandmother and walked away without apparent remorse. Janet Kimmel presented her investigation findings, explaining the patterns she'd seen in hundreds of elder abuse cases and how this one fit the profile perfectly. And then my grandmother took the stand. Watching her walk to the witness box, sworn in, sitting in that chair looking small and vulnerable under the courtroom lights, was one of the hardest moments of my life. But when Michael Torres began asking her questions, something remarkable happened. The fragile elderly woman disappeared, and in her place was the nurse who'd worked 40 years in emergency situations, who'd raised 2 kids alone, who'd survived every hardship life threw at her with grace and determination. She told her story clearly, without embellishment, her voice strong even when tears rolled down her cheeks. She described the years of limited contact with her children, the sudden increase in attention, the promises made about the trip, the transfer of her life savings, the moment at the airport when she realized she'd been deceived. "Did you give them that money as a gift with no expectation of going on the trip yourself?" Michael asked. "No," my grandmother said firmly. "I gave them that money because they told me, explicitly and repeatedly, that this was a family trip that would include me, that this was their way of finally showing me I mattered to them. If I had known there was never a ticket for me, I never would have transferred a single dollar." The defense attorney cross-examined her aggressively, trying to suggest she'd been confused about the arrangements, that she'd misunderstood what was being offered, that her memory of events wasn't reliable given her age. But my grandmother held firm, refuting each suggestion with clarity and quiet dignity. "I am 72 years old, sir," she said at one point, "but my mind is sharp. I remember every detail of what happened because it's the kind of pain that burns into your memory. My children lied to me, took my money, and abandoned me. That's not confusion, that's fact. I was called to testify next, and I recounted everything. The conversation I'd overheard outside my grandmother's kitchen, the airport confrontation, the decision to stay with her instead of enabling their theft by remaining silent. The defense tried to paint me as a rebellious teenager turning against his parents, but Michael Torres redirected effectively, pointing out that I'd given up my college funding, my relationship with my parents, my entire future security to stand up for what was right. "Paul, why did you decide to report this to Adult Protective Services?" Michael asked during my direct examination. "Because what they did was wrong," I said, looking directly at the jury. "Because my grandmother spent her entire life sacrificing for her children, and they repaid her by stealing her life savings and throwing her away like garbage. Because if I did nothing, I'd be as complicit in that abuse as they were. And because she deserved someone to fight for her, even if that meant fighting against my own parents." The defense rested without calling my parents or Aunt Paula to testify, a tactical decision that spoke volumes about how their testimony would hold up under cross-examination. Instead, they relied on character witnesses, people who testified that my parents were upstanding community members, successful professionals, devoted parents, conveniently omitting how they treated the woman who made their success possible. Closing arguments were powerful on both sides. The defense maintained this was a civil dispute being inappropriately criminalized, a family disagreement that should be resolved privately. Michael Torres painted it as exactly what it was, a calculated scheme to defraud a vulnerable elderly woman, premeditated and executed without remorse by the very people who should have protected her. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. My grandmother and I waited in a small witness room, neither of us able to eat or focus on anything except what was happening behind those closed doors. When we were finally called back into the courtroom, I felt like my heart might actually beat out of my chest. The jury foreman stood, and the judge asked for the verdict. In the matter of the state of Tennessee versus Richard Henderson, on the charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. In the matter of the state of Tennessee versus Dana Henderson, on the charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. In the matter of the state of Tennessee versus Paula Winters, on the charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in noise. I heard my mother sob, heard my father shout something about this being a miscarriage of justice, heard Aunt Paula's lawyer immediately calling for mistrial motions. But all I could focus on was my grandmother, who sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of triumph, but of deep, profound sadness. She'd just watched her children be convicted of crimes against her. There was no victory in that. Only the painful confirmation that the betrayal had been real, had been intentional, had been exactly as bad as it felt. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a woman named Sandra Kowalski who'd presided over the trial with clear-eyed fairness, delivered a statement before announcing the sentences that I'll never forget. I've been on the bench for 22 years, Judge Kowalski said, looking directly at my parents and Aunt Paula, and I've seen many cases of elder abuse. But this case is particularly egregious because of the level of premeditation involved, the vulnerability of the victim, and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendants. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson spent her entire adult life sacrificing for her children, working extra shifts as a nurse to put them through college, raising them alone after her husband abandoned the family, giving them every opportunity to succeed. And you repaid that sacrifice by manipulating her, lying to her, stealing her life savings, and abandoning her at an airport like she was trash to be discarded. You showed no conscience, no empathy, no recognition of the harm you caused. The only reason this came to light is because Mrs. Henderson's grandson had the moral courage to stand up to his own parents and fight for justice. You should be ashamed. She sentenced each of them to 3 years in prison, suspended to 18 months with strict probation terms including complete financial restitution, community service, and mandatory counseling. Additionally, the court imposed a restraining order preventing them from contacting my grandmother unless she initiated contact, and stripped them of any inheritance rights or future guardianship authority over her. The civil trial that followed was almost anticlimactic. With the criminal conviction on record, the civil case for financial damages was straightforward. The jury awarded my grandmother the full $30,000 plus an additional $20,000 in punitive damages and compensation for emotional distress. My parents and Aunt Paula were jointly liable, their assets subject to liens until the full amount was paid. They appealed, of course, dragging the process out for another year, but ultimately the conviction and the civil judgment were upheld. My grandmother received her money back, $50,000 total, but she barely touched it. "This doesn't feel like winning, Paul," she told me the day the check arrived. "I have the money back, I have justice, I have validation that what they did was wrong. But I don't have my children. I don't have the family I wanted. What kind of victory is that?" I didn't have an answer for her because she was right. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't restore the years of being undervalued, couldn't give her back the children she'd hoped her children would become. The aftermath of the trial was complex and painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents served their prison time, 18 months in minimum security facilities, and upon release immediately left Tennessee. I heard through distant relatives that they'd moved to Arizona, started over with new jobs, new identities almost, people trying to outrun the consequences of their actions. Aunt Paula and Marcus divorced. The stress of the trial and conviction apparently too much for their marriage to withstand. She moved to Florida, I think, but I honestly don't know and don't care to find out. My cousins, Jennifer and Dylan, were essentially orphaned by their parents' choices, ending up in the care of Marcus's family, people I'd never met. I should feel something about that, about family members scattered and broken, but mostly I just feel sad that it came to this, that greed and selfishness destroyed what could have been something good. My grandmother and I settled into a new normal in Millbrook. I continued my education, transferring after 2 years at community college to a 4-year university with a strong pre-med program. Commuting from Millbrook because I refused to leave my grandmother alone. She started to heal, slowly, attending her therapy sessions, reconnecting with friends, finding purpose in volunteering at the hospital where she'd once worked. But something in her had broken that never quite repaired. She was more cautious now, slower to trust, quicker to assume the worst in people's motivations. The woman who'd loved unconditionally had learned the hard way that unconditional love could be weaponized against you. I watched her sometimes, sitting on her porch or working in her garden, and I could see her mind drift to thoughts of what might have been, if her children had been different people, if she'd raised them better somehow, if there was something she could have done to prevent this outcome. Grandma, I told her more than once, this isn't your fault. You loved them the best way you knew how. What they chose to do with that love, how they chose to treat you, that's on them, not you. She'd nod and say she understood, but I don't think she ever fully believed it. Parents carry the weight of their children's failures in ways children can never fully understand until they become parents themselves. I graduated from university 4 years after the trial with a degree in biology and a 3.9 GPA. My grandmother was in the front row at commencement, crying tears of pride, wearing a corsage I'd gotten her, because she was my date to all the graduation events, the person I wanted by my side for every important moment. I applied to medical schools and got accepted to Vanderbilt's MD program, one of the best in the country. My grandmother wanted to use the restitution money to help with tuition, but I refused. That money was hers, compensation for pain and suffering, and I wasn't about to take it even for education. Instead, I took out loans, worked part-time, did what I had to do to make it work. Medical school was brutal, as anyone who's been through it can attest, but I had a purpose driving me forward. Every patient I saw during clinical rotations, I thought about my grandmother, about the 40 years she'd spent caring for people, about the kind of physician I wanted to become, one who saw patients as whole humans, not just collections of symptoms. During my 3rd year of medical school, my grandmother's health began to decline. She'd been a smoker in her younger years, before the research really came out about the dangers, and it caught up with her in the form of COPD and eventually lung cancer. She was diagnosed at stage 3, treatable but not curable, a slow march toward an inevitable ending. I took a leave of absence from school to care for her, moving back to Millbrook full-time, setting up her house with oxygen equipment and medications, learning to be her nurse the way she'd once been a nurse to so many others. Those months were gift and agony intertwined. Gift because I got to spend every day with her, listening to more stories, learning more about her life before I existed, understanding the fullness of who she'd been beyond just my grandmother. Agony because I had to watch her decline, watch this strong woman who'd survived so much become weaker, watch her struggle for each breath, know that I was going to lose the only family that ever really mattered to me. We talked about everything during those months. She told me about her regrets, mostly about staying in a marriage too long with my grandfather, about not setting better boundaries with my father and Aunt Paula when they were young, about maybe being too generous, too forgiving, too willing to make excuses for bad behavior. But Paul, she said during one of our late-night conversations, her voice raspy from the oxygen mask she wore almost constantly now, I don't regret how I loved. I don't regret being the kind of person who gives without expecting return. Because that's who I am, and changing that to protect myself would mean becoming someone I didn't recognize. Does that make sense? It makes perfect sense, Grandma, I said, holding her hand, feeling how fragile it had become. You taught me that love isn't transactional, that real love is sacrifice, that the measure of a person is how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return. You live those values even when it cost you everything. That's not something to regret. She smiled, that same gentle smile I'd known my whole life. You turned out so good, Paul. Better than I ever hoped. That's my real legacy. Not the children I raised, but the grandson who chose to be better. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, leaves turning gold and red outside her window. The Millbrook Hills painted in autumn colors she'd loved her entire life. I was holding her hand, reading to her from a book of poetry she'd kept on her nightstand, when her breathing simply stopped. Peaceful, the hospice nurse said, as good a death as anyone could hope for. I planned her funeral with the same care she'd put into tending her garden. Small, intimate, filled with people from Millbrook who'd known her not as a victim or a court case, but as Dorothy Henderson, nurse, neighbor, friend, woman who baked cookies for every community event and always had time to listen to your problems. The church was full. I delivered the eulogy, talking about her strength, her capacity for love, her unwavering moral compass, her belief that doing the right thing mattered even when it was hard. I talked about the lessons she'd taught me, about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, about family being chosen through actions not determined by blood, about living with integrity even when the world didn't reward it. I sent notice to my parents and Aunt Paula, a simple email with the service details, no personal message attached. I didn't expect them to come, and they didn't. They'd made their choices years ago, and I'd made mine. We existed in completely separate universes now, connected only by shared DNA and a court record of their crimes against the woman we'd all supposedly loved. My grandmother left me her house and what remained of her money, not much after medical expenses, but enough. More importantly, she left me a letter, handwritten in the shaky script of her final weeks, that I keep in my wallet and read whenever I need reminding of who I want to be. Paul, it read, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be facing the world without me. I need you to know some things. First, what happened with your father and Paula was not your fault. You tried to save me, and in the most important ways, you did. You showed me that real family, chosen family, is stronger than blood. You gave up your relationship with your parents to stand beside me, and I will be grateful for that courage for whatever comes after this life. Second, don't carry bitterness. What they did was wrong, and they faced consequences for it. But holding on to anger will only poison your own life. You became a good man despite them, not because of them, and that goodness is yours to keep or to lose. Third, live fully. Don't hide from love because you saw what happened to me. Yes, I was hurt by the people I loved most, but I also experienced the purest love in watching you become who you are. That trade was worth it, every single painful moment, because it led to you. Finally, make a difference. You're going to be a doctor, and you're going to be a good one because you understand that healing isn't just about fixing bodies. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, especially the ones everyone else overlooks. Be the person who shows up, who stands up, who speaks up. That's my legacy, carried forward in you. I love you, my sweet boy, my real family, my greatest joy. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for showing me that I was worth fighting for. Live well, love fully, and never doubt that you did right. Grandma, I finished medical school, graduated with honors, did my residency in family medicine because I wanted to practice the kind of comprehensive, patient-centered care my grandmother would have appreciated. I joined a practice in Millbrook, taking care of the same community she'd served for 40 years, and every time a patient reminds me of her, in their resilience or their kindness or their quiet dignity despite hardship, I feel her presence like a hand on my shoulder, encouraging me forward. I kept her house, the small yellow structure with white trim that had been my sanctuary for so many summers. I've updated it, modernized some things, but kept the bones the same, the porch swing, the garden space, the window where she used to sit watching for visitors who rarely came. Sometimes I sit in her chair and try to understand how she did it, how she kept loving despite being continuously hurt, how she maintained faith in human goodness when she had every reason to become cynical. I date occasionally, though I'm careful in ways I wasn't before seeing what happened to my grandmother. I watch for signs of people who take more than they give, who see relationships as transactions, who measure love in terms of what they can extract rather than what they can offer. It's made me cautious, maybe too cautious, but I'd rather be alone than be with someone who sees me as a resource to be exploited. I never reconciled with my parents. I've had no contact with them since the trial. No letters, no attempts at apology or explanation, nothing. I don't know if they ever felt remorse for what they did, or if they simply felt resentment at being caught. Either way, they're strangers now, people who share half my DNA but none of my values, and I've made peace with that loss. Some people aren't capable of being family, and recognizing that truth is sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself. My story doesn't have a neat, happy ending because real life rarely does. My grandmother died with justice served, but her heart still broken by her children's betrayal. I became a doctor like I dreamed, but without the parents who should have been there to celebrate with me. I found purpose and meaning in standing up for what was right, but it cost me the family I was born into. But here's what I learned, and this is the lesson I hold on to, the one I want you to take from this long, painful story. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by action, by choice, by who shows up when things get hard and stays even when staying is difficult. My grandmother was family because she loved me without condition, saw value in me beyond my achievements, created space where I could be fully human. My parents stopped being family the moment they chose money over integrity, manipulation over genuine connection. Standing up for what's right often comes at a terrible cost. I lost my parents, my extended family, my financial security, years of easy relationships, all because I chose to fight for my grandmother instead of staying silent. But staying silent would have cost me something far more valuable than comfort or convenience. It would have cost me my integrity, my self-respect, my ability to look at myself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. Justice matters, but it doesn't heal all wounds. My grandmother got her money back, saw her abusers convicted and sentenced, received validation that what happened to her was wrong. But none of that gave her back the children she'd hoped for, the family she'd dreamed of, the decades of love that went unreciprocated. Some hurts run too deep for even justice to fully address. You can love people without letting them destroy you. My grandmother taught me this in the hardest way possible. She loved her children completely, sacrificially, without reservation, and they used that love as a weapon against her. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse. It doesn't mean allowing people to exploit your generosity or take advantage of your kindness. Real love, healthy love, includes boundaries, includes the strength to say no, includes the wisdom to protect yourself from people who see your love as weakness rather than gift. The people who matter will see your worth. I spent 18 years in a house where I was valued for my grades and achievements, but not seen for who I actually was. Then I spent summers in Millbrook where my grandmother saw me, fully and completely, valued me not for what I could do, but for who I was. That taught me that if you're surrounded by people who only appreciate you conditionally, the problem isn't you, it's them. Find your people, your real family, the ones who choose you and keep choosing you. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing completely alone. When I made the decision not to board that plane, when I called Adult Protective Services, when I testified against my own parents in court, I did all of it alone. No one else stepped up. No one else was willing to risk comfort for justice. And that loneliness was excruciating. But it was also clarifying because I learned that I could stand alone if I had to, that my moral compass didn't require backup or approval or consensus. Doing right is its own reward, even when the reward feels inadequate. Your life has value beyond what you can provide others. This is maybe the most important lesson, the one my grandmother never quite learned for herself. She measured her worth by how well she could serve her children, how much she could sacrifice, how completely she could love despite receiving little in return. And that left her vulnerable to people who saw her as an ATM machine rather than a human being deserving of love. Your value is inherent, not earned. You deserve respect, consideration, genuine affection, not because of what you do, but because of who you are. So here I am at 34, a family physician in a small Tennessee town, living in my grandmother's house, caring for a community she loved, carrying forward the lessons she taught me through both her incredible strength and her painful vulnerability. I think about her every day, about what she endured, what she taught me, what her life meant. And I think about that day at the Atlanta airport when I had to choose between the easy path and the right path, between family loyalty that demanded silence and moral courage that demanded action. I chose right, and it cost me everything I thought was family. But it gave me something more valuable. It gave me integrity, purpose, the knowledge that when tested, I had the strength to stand up even when standing up meant standing alone. If you're reading this and you're facing a similar choice, if you're watching someone you love being exploited or abused, if you're torn between loyalty to people who share your blood and loyalty to what's right, I want you to know something. The easy choice, staying silent, keeping the peace, not making waves, that will haunt you forever. You'll lie awake wondering what would have happened if you'd spoken up, if you'd acted, if you'd chosen courage over comfort. The hard choice, standing up, speaking out, fighting for justice even when justice comes at personal cost, that will hurt in the short term. You might lose relationships you thought were unbreakable. You might face retaliation, isolation, consequences you didn't fully anticipate. But you'll be able to live with yourself. You'll know that when it mattered most, you chose right over easy. And sometimes, that knowledge is all we get. Not happy endings, not restored relationships, not vindication that feels satisfying, just the quiet certainty that we did what we could with what we had, that we stood up when staying seated would have been simpler, that we fought for people who deserved fighting for. My grandmother deserved someone to fight for her, and I'm honored that I got to be that person. She shaped who I am in ways my parents never could have, taught me lessons about love and strength and integrity that I'll carry for the rest of my life. And even though she's gone, even though the family I was born into imploded, even though justice felt hollow in the face of betrayal, I don't regret a single choice I made. I'd do it all again, every painful moment, because she was worth it. Because doing right is always worth it, even when it costs everything. Especially then.